This morning, we're going to look at Mark 13, verses 1 through 27. Mark 13, verses 1 through 27. That's what our guide tells us to look at. And they titled it, Signs of the Times. Signs of the Times. So, that's the text we'll be looking at. Prayer request this morning. This passage of Scripture is often called the Olivet Discourse. And that's because this teaching that Jesus gave was delivered on the Mount of Olives. It initially started with 4 of the disciples. I don't know if the others were on the edges listening, or if the actual teaching just involved those 4. Mark is the only gospel that records that these 4 were the ones that it was spoken to. These 4 disciples mentioned in Mark 13:3, Peter, James, John, and Andrew, were the first 4 that he called. And like I said, the others may have heard or may not have heard what was being said here at the time. This is sometimes called the discourse of last things. And it's sometimes called the little apocalypse because it's similar to the book of Revelation. It's the longest discourse in the book of Mark. And it is one of the most debated sections in the book of Mark. It has its parallels in Matthew 24, 1 through 25:46, Luke 21, 5 through 36. The conflict between Jesus and the leaders of the temple has reached a crisis point. He has condemned the temple. He has condemned the leaders of the temple. As the Gospels lay this story out, Jesus has left the temple for the last time. The disciples and others who hear the story might connect this with what happens in the book of Ezekiel, chapter 9, verse 3, 10, 18 through 11:23. Where the Spirit of God, or the Shekinah glory, leaves the temple. So we have that idea. The temple is doomed. The temple is doomed when the presence of God leaves it. The disciples at this point were admiring the stones, admiring the structure of the temple. And, Michael Card, in his little commentary on the book of Mark, wonders if they were not trying to distract Jesus from all the conflict that was going on in his head and just make small talk, if you will. Interesting point. We don't know which disciple commented on the stones or the temple structure. Some speculate it might have been Peter, because he's always speaking. Notice that they pointed out what large stones. Now let's think about this temple for a little bit. This is the second temple. This is the temple that Ezra, Zerubbabel, Haggai, and Zechariah had a part in building. But in 20 BC, 19 BC, Herod the Great, trying to ingratiate himself toward the Jews, started a remodeling project of the temple. This project would go on for 80 years, only stopping about AD 63, 64. In this project, the temple compound was expanded. Some commentaries I read said it covered 19 acres. Another one said 35 acres. This is a huge complex. The original building that Zerubbabel and Haggai and Zechariah and Joshua the high priest oversaw the building of was expanded. Large stones is something that they pointed out. And, sometimes math is not my forte. But some of the lengths of stones were anywhere from 37.5 feet to 67.5 feet. They ranged in height from 7.5 feet to 12 feet. They ranged in width 9 feet to 18 feet wide. One was measured at being over 600 tons. No, wait a minute. Yeah, that's what I wrote down. 600 tons. That's a rock. So, the beauty of the temple, white marble, some parts of it overlaid with gold. Silver, bronze, Corinthian bronze doors. This was a spectacular place to look at. They were admiring the beauty of the temple. Jesus' words must have sent shockwaves through them. I tell you, not one stone will be left on the other. Not one stone would be left on another. As we already pointed out, that this process of modernization or revitalizing the temple began in 20 or 19 BC, and it would continue until about 63 AD. In 70 AD, it will be completely destroyed. it will be completely destroyed. When they come to the Mount of Olives is across the Kidron Valley. It's above, it rises 200 to 300 feet above the city of Jerusalem. And they're able to look over and see the temple. They can see the temple in all its grandeur. And so these 4 disciples, they asked the question, when will this be? And what will be the sign that all these things are about to be accomplished? In Matthew 24, verse 3, the questions run like this. When will this be? What will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? And it's at this point that the passage becomes controversial because of different points of view about eschatology. So, what are your options? Is he talking about one event through the whole chapter? Or is he talking about 2 or more events throughout the chapter? Does it apply only to the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70? Or does it also prefigure his coming at the end of time? And based upon your answer to those questions, you come up with different interpretations. Yes, sir.
To me, it's pretty clear that it's both.
Okay. Yeah. I think so too. But yet again, the other points of view are out there. And when we talk about both, there are some that take it all in the past. There are others that say it's all in the future. And I'm more along the lines that you expressed, both. And I will also say this. I think there are multiple fulfillments of the prophecy. Not just one fulfillment in the past, and not just one fulfillment in the future, but fulfillments as we go along till that final end. And my basis for my idea of Scripture, interpretation of prophecy, goes back to the prophecy that God gave to David. When David wanted to build the temple, God said, no, you're not going to. But your son will. Each time a temple was built in Jerusalem, Solomon built the first one, descendant of David. Second time temple was built, Zerubbabel, a descendant of David. We believe that the church is the temple of God now. Who built it? And who is he? A descendant of David. So, I think those points are very important to remember. Some of the stuff in that passage cannot apply to Solomon or any other of David's descendants but Jesus. Okay, so that was a sidetrack. That was a rabbit's path. So, as I said, how you answer those questions. Is it one event, two events, or more events, or is it, fulfilled in ways as we go on? So here's some key verses, though, that are things that I think you should look at. What does verses 5, 9, 23, 33, 35, and 37 say to the disciples? Verse 5, 9, 23, 33, 35, and 27. 37 say to the disciples. To watch. Be on guard. Beware. So this is first the message to the disciples. And what are they to be on guard about? Well, that doesn't quite get to everything, but they're to be on guard against a certain thing. Won't be deceived. And he will go into talking about people coming in my name, or coming pretending to be me. Matthew has an interesting way of putting that. He says, don't go out to the wilderness. And since Matthew was writing to a Jewish audience, where did the deliverers many times come from, especially the first great deliverer of the people of Israel? The wilderness. Moses came out of the wilderness. So, the Messiah will come from the wilderness. When we read the book of Acts, chapter 5:36 mentions two people that were Messiah-like figures of the time. And they led a group of people to destruction. Gamaliel warned against those. There's another one in Acts 21 that's that the Roman guard calls the Egyptian. So that's just three of the false messiahs, if you will, that have appeared in history. And if you look through the literature, there are many that have appeared. Several as Jewish messiahs. After 135 AD, after the Bar Kokhba rebellion, his name means the star, the Jews became a little skeptical of Messiah, the concept of Messiah. I wish Jim Hall were here so he could say this guy's name. There are many messiahs that are throughout history, as we said. Probably one of the most recent ones died in 1994. He was a rabbi in New York. His name was Schneerson. Schneerson. And he was thought to be Messiah. So, now, that's just Jewish history. There was an article in National Geographic several years ago about 5 men who claimed to be Messiah. So false messiahs is not something that was limited to just the time before the destruction of the temple. Yes?
I'm trying to remember, did Joseph Smith, did he claim to be, or did people attribute, did his followers attribute?
Well, I don't know about Joseph Smith being, but an interesting one is the founder of the Shakers. She claimed to be the female version of the Messiah. David Koresh claimed to be a Messiah. Jim Jones and others. So, false messiahs, false teachers. And they don't exactly have to have everything false. If they had everything false, people might not listen to them. But maybe just one or two things. Maybe they overemphasize something or underemphasize something else. And therefore they become false teachers, false messiahs, those that make us feel good about our positions and our thinking. So, notice in verse 8, and we'll touch a little bit on, so he said, many will come in my name and say that I am he, and they will lead many astray. Then it talks about wars and rumors of wars. Do not be alarmed, these must take place, but the end is still to come. Nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes in various places, and there will be famines. The phrase that I want you to look at is at the end of verse 8. This is but the beginning of birth pangs. What does that imply if we take it as it is written?
As bad as those things are, the worst things to come.
Right.
It's the beginning.
It's the beginning. So might we speculate, notice I should speculate, that these things, wars, rumors of wars, earthquakes, famines, plagues, might we speculate that before Jesus descends from the clouds, that these things will get worse? Notice I said speculate. So, that's a possibility. But let's tie it back to what Jesus was talking about in the first century. There was always wars and rumors of wars in the first century. The Romans had a fear that the Parthians would invade them. Did I get that right, David? Yeah. That the Parthians would invade them. They were scared to death of that. And then after the fall of Jerusalem, after the death of Nero, they always had this Nero redivivus theory, that Nero didn't actually commit suicide. He went off and lived with the Parthians, and he was going to lead them in and invade. So there was all kinds of rumors like that. Then there were actual wars that came up. And then specifically for the Jews, there were things like Caligula and Nero and others that just hated the Jews for various reasons, and some of it was their own doing. But those were always swirling around. Wars, rumors of wars, kingdom against kingdom, nation against nation. Before AD 70. There were earthquakes before AD 70. There was one in Crete, 46, 47 AD. Rome, AD 51. This one was interesting because this was the time that Nero was in their society, became a man. He gained his manly toga, as the phrasing goes. So just imagine what that did to his twisted mind at a later period, probably. There was an earthquake when I became a man. There were two in Phrygia, one at Apamea, another one at Laodicea in AD 53, AD 60. The one at Laodicea is probably referenced to in the book of Revelation. There were famines. There was another one in Campanodia in AD 63. There were famines. There were 3 in the reign of Claudius alone. Judea, Greece, and Rome. And one of them is mentioned in the book of Acts, where the church at Antioch sends help to Jerusalem because of the famine. Again, emphasizing the point, beware. This is going to happen to you. Beware. You're going to be handed over to councils, synagogue leaders. You're going to be beaten. You're going to stand before governors and kings because of me, as a testimony to them. That's verse 9. And we see much of that happening in the book of Acts. Acts 4 and 5. I think there's another one. Acts 4 and 5, I'm sure of, where the disciples stood before the council. Then, as you move on into the book of Acts, you see Paul before not only the Jewish leaders, but you see him before the Roman leaders, such as Agrippa, Festus, yes, Felix.
This is actually fine. Jesus is telling this to these 4 guys.
That's after the fact. You're absolutely right. Jesus is telling them this is going to happen. He gives them the message, beware. He gives them the message, beware. False teachers, false prophets, false messiahs will come. Beware. You will face trials. You will face persecution, if you will. You will face tribulation, if you will. Notice as we go on in this passage there at and the good news must first be proclaimed to all nations. So the good news, the gospel, is going to be proclaimed to all nations. Some will argue that it was done in the first century, and they will cite Colossians 1:6, 23, 2 Timothy 4:17. But that's not the case today. There's still parts of the world that do not know the gospel. Several years ago, they talked about the 1040 window. And I forget exactly. It's the longitude and latitude. And I don't know which one is which, but mostly that's in a territory that is dominated by the Muslim religion, that don't know the gospel of Christ. Let's see. Is it time to go?
We'll give you a few more.
Okay. Notice that in here, when they were facing this, that Jesus told them the Spirit would give what to say. Now, don't take this to mean that if I get up here and don't prepare, the Spirit's going to tell me what to say. No, that's not what that means at all. But in those situations where they were called before the courts, they were given what to say, or were guided what to say at that point. Now, let's briefly touch on the abomination of desolation, or the desolating sacrilege. This is connected with Daniel 9:27, Daniel 11:31, Daniel 12:11. It first applied to Antiochus Epiphanes in 168 BC. 1 Maccabees 1:54 tells us about it. He set up an image of Zeus in the temple, and he offered a pig. He threw the blood of the pig throughout the temple. Uh-oh, you got a problem with the Jews. And then he turned the temple courts into a brothel. Not just any brothel, but a brothel dedicated to one of the gods. So, that's in the past. But what did Jesus mean now? A couple of possibilities for that time period. Before the destruction of Jerusalem, the people fled to the temple because it was the strongest building that was there. It was the most sturdy building. Remember those rocks that we talked about? It's the most sturdy building. But at this point, the Jews themselves desecrated the temple. The Sicarii is a group of Jewish assassins who like to kill Romans, among others. They seem to be a splintered group from the Zealots themselves, but the Zealots were involved too. So they do some murders in the temple, and possibly a murder of a high priest. Then, not only that, they install a clown by the name of Phani, Phanni, as the high priest. Some see this as the desolating sacrilege or the abomination of desolation before the Romans destroyed the temple. Then, of course, the Romans burned the temple. And they erected the standard of the empire in that area and may have offered a sacrifice that was supposed to purify the land in their way of thinking: an ox, a pig, and a lamb. Now, our problem is, does it have a future fulfillment? If we connect this with the passage in Thessalonians that talks about the man of sin who sets himself up and proclaims himself to be God, he sets himself above everything that is called God and claims himself to be God. That's a possibility that somehow this man has the powers of government, the powers of religion in his hand. We might call him Antichrist, the world ruler. And this is a fulfillment of this abomination of desolation. Another possibility, and don't throw this aside, that there's yet to be a future third temple. Now, why do I say don't discount it? There's a group in Israel called the Temple Institute. What's their goal? To rebuild the temple. It's a small minority group. There's a great big problem with wanting to rebuild the temple now, which is
They don't own the land.
and the Dome of the Rock. Yeah. In September the 20th edition, 2022, the Jerusalem Post carried an article about 5 red heifers being shipped from Texas to Israel. Why is the red heifers important? Blood and the ashes purify the land. So, okay, that's enough of my rambling. Some points that we should keep in mind is, Jesus warned us, be on guard against false teachers. Be ready to face persecution. Even though you hear of wars, rumors of wars, famines, earthquakes, the end's not yet. But when the end comes, you will know it.
Thanks, Craig.
Thank you, Greg.